On the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I want to address a big and panoramic idea about democracy and its foes. One of the themes of this podcast is the degree to which propaganda has done so much to shape authoritarian regimes of the past century or so around the world, as well as the current crisis in the United States. The rise of Rush Limbaugh and Fox News, and before them, grifter television evangelists, all turned out to be critical in halting the country's movement toward ideals of equality and true representation, instead bringing democracy to the brink of collapse. Yet the U.S. disaster is mirrored around the world in parallel political disasters with rising authoritarian parties and movements.
Labour's Samantha Niblett, who represents South Derbyshire.
One thing that's awful is in 2017, there were about 3 organisations that were anti-trans, campaigning for anti-trans rights. There are now 51. In newspapers, there are about 17 stories a day that are anti-trans. And I'm sorry, but that is not proportionate for 0.5% of the population to have so much light shine on them.
Something larger than just the U.S. is going on.
We've also seen devastation across the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Our understanding is that at least 13 people have been killed in that large-scale Russian missile and drone strike on Kyiv.
And as always, it's worth paying attention to the very particular history of the country, but also trends on the global stage.
Other news to bring you in that Russian athletes could be allowed to compete for their country at the 2028 Olympic Games in LA.
And it isn't always about propaganda from governments or from big companies.
Let's see if they'll let me in. My name is Walter Masterson. Are you letting press cover this event? No.
Sometimes personal exchanges can drive the turn toward embracing policies of hate and exclusion.
Why are you a log-cabin Republican when Trump administration is trying to take away all of our rights? He's trying to take away all the LGBTQ rights. Yours. Mine? He's like, oh, he's taking yours, not mine.
Those can be a little harder to measure.
It's actually an honest response was, he's taking away yours, not mine. I'm fine with you losing your rights. I'm going to keep mine.
So for today's episode, I want to talk about a recent experiment described in a paper published not 2 weeks ago in the American Journal of Political Science. The study looked at how authoritarianism infected individuals through small communities and peer pressure, changing views and shifting community consensus. It's a window on how to think about the corruption and violence in America today, why people are going along with it, and how to stop it.
Breaking news from the Magnolia Park neighborhood. A man shot in the stomach with ICE agents and federal investigators on scene. Within the last few moments, we've confirmed that man has died.
The paper's title is Support for Authoritarian Rule Contagious? Its authors, political scientist Sirian Dalum at Norway's University of Oslo and Torbjørn Hansen of the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, along with several other people, set up field and survey experiments with incoming members of Norwegian armed forces. They surveyed the incoming groups before and after boot camp. On intake, they measured individual attitudes toward authoritarianism. With their subjects randomly assigned to different quarters, researchers could measure shifts in attitude after exposure to peers with similar or different ideas. After 8 weeks of training, they returned to record changes. They made a striking discovery, determining that, in fact, not only were participants aware of the prevailing opinion about authoritarianism in their quarters, but a lot of individuals increased their level of support for authoritarianism to match their peers' beliefs. Even recruits who initially possessed low or moderate levels of openness to authoritarian rule, they wrote, noticeably open up for strong leader governance when exposed to peers with preferences for authoritarian rule. One issue with this finding is that the authors couldn't be sure exactly what triggered the increased support for authoritarian rule.
Increasingly, it's Norway's women stepping up as the country's first line of defense because of the increased threats across Northern Europe.
Perhaps the incoming trainees had been convinced through personal persuasion.
This is especially true in the north. where the country shares a 200-kilometer border with Russia.
Or maybe someone shared information on the topic, or even propaganda with them.
Norway's army wants to lead the way in gender equality. At the same time, nearly every second female enlistee reports sexual harassment in the barracks.
It might also have been possible that the subjects simply conformed to the group identity of those they saw as their social peers.
Despite the Army's progress recruiting women, there's only one woman in their 5-member executive leadership team so far.
Researchers also wondered whether people at a young age and in the hierarchical setting of military training might be particularly susceptible to indoctrination.
My name is Dr. Russell Razak. I'm a psychiatrist.
To address these issues, they plotted additional study, hoping to answer 2 questions.
Now, in very simple terms, an authoritarian personality is somebody who feels a deep need to follow authority, to follow strict rules and codes.
1, what is the actual mechanism of how views on authoritarianism shift? And 2, were the results they got from young recruits arriving from military training generalizable to broader groups of human beings? The authors conducted additional boot camp surveys, informing the subjects accurately in advance about whether or not the other recruits in their group supported authoritarian rule. This knowledge had the effect of changing not just the recruits' perception of others' support for authoritarianism, but in changing their own levels of support. Expanding the surveys to the broader Norwegian population, the authors found that the tendency held.
Welcome back to the Oslo Freedom Forum.
People who found themselves among groups with support for authoritarian rule changed their own opinions toward greater support themselves.
3.5 billion people are not living in freedom.
Norway was a good setting for this experiment as a whole because it tends to rank high on global democracy indices.
That statistic demands a response. And that response, in our case, the responsibility that we take at the Human Rights Foundation and our associated partners here in Norway, that response is the Oslo Freedom Forum.
Over time, Scandinavian nations have typically occupied the top 5 spots, with Norway in first or second place.
Authoritarian power isn't just a ruler, it's a system. It teaches fear, it corrupts truth, it captures institutions. It makes you believe that resistance is useless.
The country has a strong social network of healthcare and education for all, and would seem to have created institutional guardrails against typical resentments that have been thought of as seed corn for planting authoritarianism in a given society. So it's particularly troubling that support for authoritarianism would be so socially malleable in a truly entrenched democracy. But the researchers didn't stop there. They wound up surveying more than 25,000 participants from at least 29 countries and consistently found that preferences for authoritarian rule could be shifted by knowing what others thought. If the researchers still didn't know all the mechanisms that could trigger that shift, they appeared to have determined that knowing a group of peers supported authoritarian rule was enough to shift individuals further toward doing the same. It's worth taking a minute to address authoritarianism itself. For nearly a century, practitioners in different fields, from historians and political scientists to psychologists and psychiatrists, have tried to address the rise of strongmen and how they come to appeal to populations around the world. In the wake of World War II, the main attempts were to analyze fascist movements.
Now, in 1950, a man called Theodore Adorno, a psychologist, started to think, what is it that led people to essentially bring in the kind of authoritarian leaders that led to the World War in the first place?
And early models sometimes, understandably, focused on right-wing government policies and attributes.
Psychodynamic or Freudian theory of the development of authoritarianism explain what has happened as being due to 2 reasons.
But there's also been an attempt to understand how it is that people become susceptible to supporting such dangerous forms of government, which led to more psychological analysis. What kind of person was vulnerable to being drawn to authoritarian leaders?
Firstly, harsh Punitive parenting and rigid parental values cause a tension between anxiety or fear of disapproval and punishment and hostility or anger towards parents.
The psychological approach tried to identify people who wanted to submit to an authority figure or who wanted to be subordinate to someone who would do harm on their behalf.
And secondly, suppression of impulses leads to displacement of aggression towards safer or weaker targets, such as ethnic minorities.
But one issue is that policies like mistreatment of women, immigrants, and people of color don't only draw people who already support those viewpoints.
There is no problem of racist speech on campus. There is no problem with racism. There is no problem with sexism. Or to the extent there is a problem, it is not very big.
They draw people in who had not held those ideas before or who had held them latently rather than taking action on them.
That was then 28-year-old Peter Thiel promoting his book at an event hosted by the Heritage Foundation in 1996. The book was titled The Diversity Myth, Multiculturalism, and the Politics of Intolerance at Stanford.
It turned out that a tremendously broad range of people in extreme situations can wind up supporting authoritarianism.
George Packer, thank you for coming back on Morning Joe.
So the authors of this study looked more specifically at one concrete aspect: individual support for a strong leader with overwhelming power in a political system structured to maximize the leader's ability to act.
They've now come around, having been hardcore libertarians all their lives, to a view that government can actually be useful to their financial interests, their business interests, and their sense that really the world should be ruled by a small number of very smart, very wealthy men.
This is less a theory of every psychological nook and cranny of authoritarianism than an attempt to understand how support for authoritarian government is expanding so rapidly as it is right now.
I think George has hit on something here that I think we don't underline enough. These guys are bending the knee because of opportunity.
I've been thinking recently about the book Cultural Backlash, written by Pippa Norris and Ronald Englehart.
Today we are joined by Pippa Norris.
It came out in 2018, a year after my concentration camp history was published.
This isn't just something which is about the communication format, nor is it just something about the leadership. It's actually rooted in society.
Norris and Englehart consider the rise of authoritarian leaders who had begun to expand their support in several European countries to double digits at the time their book was written.
You can look at Germany, and you look at the Alternative for Germany, a radical right party. You can look at Norway, some of the most progressive countries in the world, Sweden, and they have radical right parties or authoritarian populist parties.
And in the years since it came out, those numbers have continued to grow into the present, with few exceptions, one of them being Hungary, where the public definitively rejected the authoritarian model run by Orbán.
What's happened over time, and it started in the 80s and has continued ever since, is that cultural issues have increasingly become important. And the trouble with cultural issues is you can't divide them up very easily.
For their book, Norris and Englehart defined authoritarianism as prioritizing collective security for the tribe at the expense of individual autonomy.
These are issues which people feel passionately about. They're people's identities, and they feel basically they're zero-sum. If one side wins, the other side loses.
They identified three components of authoritarianism. First, security over any risk of instability and disorder. They give examples such as the rhetoric of foreigners stealing jobs, immigrants assaulting women, or terrorists threatening the country.
They're scum. You know what scum is? They're scum. They're sick people. They're led by sick people. And they're vicious, violent people.
The second component is an emphasis on conformity to preserve some conventional way of life.
And if you were here 15, 20 years ago, and if somebody made a speech about transgender for everyone, I always say transgender because for everyone, transgender.
And the third is the expectation of loyalty and obedience towards strong champions.
People like Comey have created tremendous danger, I think, for politicians and others. Comey is a dirty cop. He's a very dirty cop.
They laid out how populist rhetoric can combine with authoritarian values to create a cult of fear. Populism takes aim at elites who can be egregious in how they behave or in their corruption, But when populism targets indiscriminately, it can also disrupt faith in elected government or public institutions more broadly. How does that happen, you might ask?
Let me just mention briefly one threat in particular that should concern all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike, especially those who serve in our Congress.
Populist rhetoric that takes aim upward can be deflected outward to whole parties and institutions by authoritarian leaders.
The epidemic of malicious fake news and false propaganda that flooded social media over the past year.
Successful strategic deflection corrodes social trust as a whole, confidence in all institutions, and faith in democracy altogether.
It's now clear that so-called fake news can have real-world consequences.
So if you adopt populist rhetoric or tactics, be attentive to what you're taking aim at and how your attacks might be used by unscrupulous actors.
Don't be rude. No, I'm not going to give you a question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Of course, authoritarian leaders around the globe would like nothing more than for us to throw up our hands and declare the current wreckage of government as hopeless and assume that people like them are simply inevitable.
Law firms and universities cutting deals with the Trump administration, hoping acquiescence buys safety. Donors going quiet, institutions falling in line. That is all of this, how modern authoritarianism works.
But if we decide not to do that, how can we respond to these tsunamis of authoritarianism?
This book. It's called On Courage by Julia Angwin and Ami Fields-Meyer. On Courage.
The answer is a global one, a national one, and a local one.
All Ami and I did was call up dissidents around the world and ask them what they did, how they did it. And it turns out it was much more doable than I thought.
In the big picture, we need to maintain international coalitions on specific issues and on democracy itself, even where governments like that of the United States have rejected collaboration on key issues such as climate, renewable energy, and other topics.
It's about them taking your rights and taking your money for themselves. The only way they can do that is if you don't pay attention, if you don't care. And so caring is the courageous thing.
Here in the U.S., experts in everything from children's health to immigration and education can work to reestablish sites of public exchange and information, such as those previously hosted at the CDC.
And so you have to care about people who you may not know. They're not necessarily part of your community, but if you start to care about what's happening to them, that actually prevents the regime from demonizing them and focusing everyone's attention on that instead of on what they are doing.
As we work to retake the reins of government itself in this country, we can begin to protect these fonts of information more fully, both by custom and by statute.
What we've seen all over the world is that the civil resistance movements that are the most effective are not the ones that only rely on the normative democratic processes like voting, although that's important while we still can, but also the ones that try to inflict the highest cost and the most pain and just make it inconvenient to continue.
When we're able to attain a Congress without Trumpist control of it, political leaders need to make propaganda more difficult to disseminate with consequences for corporations and institutions spreading conspiracy theories.
Orban was incredibly clever, right? He did not use violence to enact his authoritarian rule. He very carefully made it all look legal. He changed the Constitution. He took control of the press, and controlling the media, by the way, is 90% of the game for authoritarians.
But in the immediate time frame and on the everyday scale, we can begin to secure our safety and shift awareness in our own communities at the state level and below.
What also was interesting to me is that it was the existence of these independent media that were hanging in for dear life that also helped turn the tide, right? They were just relentless with their $4, putting out YouTube videos and printing on websites and doing the best they could to get the message out about the corruption.
Protecting local educational institutions, our schools and libraries, remains critical.
And it really was the story of corruption that sold the people on throwing out Orban, right? Because the truth is, authoritarianism is always about corruption.
We can push for transparency in local government on everything from data centers to sanitation contracts, demanding regulations and ordinances that limit corruption and cronyism.
The vast majority of the people are kind of in the middle and kind of like, I don't know which side should I go on, or I'm confused, and they need to be persuaded.
But perhaps most critical is to speak up. You might remember that I've referenced the study that found that Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 actually shifted the political landscape in measurable ways and made a difference in the 2020 presidential election. Its influence was seen as particularly strong in smaller, whiter, and less educated populations. That study mentioned the work of Zachary Steinert-Thruckeld, who noted that protest participation can create a ripple effect whereby one protester potentially influences multiple non-participants. Showing up can make a difference.
The entire point of resistance is that there are more of us.
And my thought is that it was due especially to the exposure these communities had to ideas that countered the dominant ones where they lived.
They might have all the guns, but there are more of us literally just numbers-wise. And so to build those communities, you actually have to build those human bonds.
In places where authoritarian views are perceived as normal and legitimate, people saw their neighbors stand up for something else. The results make me wonder if those protests acted as a reverse of the authoritarian social contagion that's been underway for many years now, showing people that their neighbors were willing to publicly identify against authoritarianism instead.
Most of the dissidents whose stories, these heroic stories that gets told in the book, they found themselves becoming dissidents, not because they were destined for it from birth, but simply because they were stubborn.
If we know that support for authoritarian rule can be influenced by something as simple as knowing that others support authoritarian rule, then it's incumbent on all of us who can to speak up.
And because they insisted on paying attention to their own quiet internal moral compass that told them that what was going on around them was wrong and that they shouldn't acquiesce to it.
This study out of Norway shows that in communities with a free flow of information, as should be the case, the malleability of public opinion is a serious risk. And this kind of peer influence on people supporting strongmen when they realize others do means that norms can shift radically in a short period, just as we've seen here in the U.S. in the last decade.
Quote, a conflict often faced by people in authoritarian societies, a collision between the head and the heart, between values deeply held and an outside world unfolding in dramatic divergence. It can happen over decades or in an instant. It comes of morality, or it arises out of necessity.
This runs deeper than Trumpism. And one way that each of us can push back is to let our peers know, through word and deed, that the current situation is against our values, that the authoritarian response is a shameful one based in fear and weakness. There are a million ways you can take on that challenge, through art, through writing, through community cleanups, through calls for accountability, through social get-togethers. The main thing is to do something to stake your claim to a broader and more inclusive world and make those who support authoritarian rule into the decided minority where you live and around the world.
Thanks for listening to Next Comes What. Please share this with one person who's looking for ways to survive this mess. To support this podcast, please become a paid subscriber at AndreaPitzer.com and consider giving Next Comes What a 5-star review where you get your podcasts.
And that's it.